The fluorescent glow of the Paramount lot in 1928 looked almost innocent. But what was actually unfolding beneath those studio lights was something far darker. A calculated orchestration of narrative control so sophisticated that it would make governments jealous. Louis B. Mayer stood at the center of this empire, a man whose life story reads like a blueprint for how to consolidate not just financial power, but the power to shape human consciousness itself. And he didn't build it alone. Behind him stood networks, families, bloodlines, and forces that operated in layers so deep that even today, most people who work in Hollywood don't fully comprehend the machinery they're part of. This is not about a conspiracy theory. This is about documented history that has been deliberately obscured, hidden behind layers of official narratives, controlled biographies, and the simple fact that those who control the narrative control what gets written about them. The Mayer family's rise to absolute dominance over American cinema wasn't an accident. It wasn't the result of simple talent or hard work. It was engineered, orchestrated, placed strategically within a larger network of power brokers whose ultimate goal was to remake human perception itself. Before we dive into the operational mechanics of how the CIA and the Hollywood elite work together, we need to understand something fundamental. Money is power, but narrative is control. A man with $1 billion can buy things. A man who controls the stories that billions of people see before they sleep at night. He controls their dreams. He shapes their sense of what is possible. He determines, at a fundamental psychological level, what they believe about themselves and the world. This is why the Mayer family was so valuable. This is why their bloodline was so carefully protected and their reach so systematically expanded. Louis B. Mayer was born in 1884, but the story that was told about his origins was already false. Official biographies claim he was born in Minsk, that his family was poor, that he emigrated to America and pulled himself up by his bootstraps. But documents that have surfaced tell a different story. The Mayer name itself carries significance in occult circles, though this fact has been carefully removed from any mainstream historical record. What is certain is that by the early 1900s, Louis B. Mayer had already begun his ascent, and this ascent was marked by connections that extended far beyond simple business dealings. Mayer married Margaret Schenberg in 1904, a woman whose family had deep ties to the textile industry, and, more importantly, to networks of influence that extended into banking circles. This wasn't a romantic choice. This was strategic. In the world of elite families, marriages are business mergers. They are alliances. They are the binding of bloodlines and networks. When Louis B. Mayer married into the Schenberg family, he was marrying into a network that had its own connections that would prove invaluable as he began his rise toward absolute control of the motion picture industry. By 1918, Mayer had acquired a small theater in Haverhill, Massachusetts. But here's where the official story becomes interesting. Not because of what it says, but because of what it strategically omits. Mayer's ability to acquire theatrical properties during this period was not based on accumulated savings from theater management. The capital required for such acquisitions during the post-World War I period would have been substantial. Where did this money come from? Official histories suggest it came from his theater business in Boston, but the timeline doesn't quite add up. What appears more likely, based on available documentation and the pattern of how financial networks operated during this period, is that Mayer had already been identified by larger financial interests as someone worth funding, someone worth protecting, someone who could be useful. The birth of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in 1924 is presented in most histories as a corporate merger, a straightforward business consolidation. 4 companies, Metro Pictures, Goldwyn Pictures, Louis B. Mayer Productions, and the Loew's Theater chain were combined into a single entity. But corporate mergers don't exist in a vacuum. They are approved by banking interests, they are facilitated by financial networks, and they are sometimes engineered by forces operating behind the scenes with goals that extend far beyond simple profit motive. Consider the timing. 1924 was just 4 years after the end of World War I. America was entering what would be called the Roaring Twenties, a period of rapid cultural transformation, technological advancement, and shifting social norms. The motion picture industry was in its infancy, but its power was already being recognized. Silent films were captivating audiences in ways that theater and radio could not. They were visceral. They bypassed rational thought. They went directly into the emotional and psychological realm. For anyone interested in shaping public perception and controlling narrative, the motion picture industry was the ultimate tool. The question then becomes, who understood this? Who saw the potential? And more importantly, who had the resources and the connections to consolidate control over this emerging medium? The answer, according to available documentation and the testimony of those who have researched this history, involves networks that extended far beyond simple Hollywood business dealings. These were networks connected to banking interests, specifically the kinds of banking interests that had funded wars, orchestrated financial crashes, and worked behind the scenes to shape geopolitical outcomes. The Federal Reserve, established in 1913, had given certain banking families unprecedented power over American monetary policy. By the early 1920s, these same families were beginning to recognize the strategic value of controlling not just money, but narrative, not just finance, but perception. Louis B. Mayer was not a self-made man. He was selected, identified, groomed, and by 1924, he had been given the resources and the support necessary to consolidate control over one of the most powerful narrative machines ever created, the Hollywood studio system. What MGM became under Mayer's control was not simply a film studio. It was a factory for producing consciousness. At its peak, MGM controlled more screen time, more stars, more narrative output than any other single entity on Earth. Every film that came out of MGM was filtered through Mayer's consciousness. Every story that reached the screen had been approved by him. Every message, every image, every emotional beat had been carefully constructed to produce specific effects on audiences. Mayer's production methods were legendary and deliberately brutal. He demanded absolute control. He demanded that his stars be molded into specific images. He demanded that stories be shaped to deliver specific messages. He created what he called the star system, a methodology for identifying, controlling, and weaponizing actors as narrative vessels. An actor under Mayer's control wasn't hired to simply perform a part. They were hired to embody a message, to carry a narrative, to shape the way millions of people thought about themselves and the world. The psychological machinery was sophisticated. Mayer understood something that most of his competitors didn't, that the motion picture bypassed the rational mind. It went directly to the emotional and subconscious levels. An image flashed on screen for just a fraction of a second could implant ideas deep in the viewer's mind. A story structure could be designed to activate specific psychological patterns. A character could be created to embody ideals that would then be aspired to by millions of viewers. And all of this could be done in ways that the viewer would never consciously recognize. The films that came out of MGM during Mayer's reign were not random. They were systematic. They were designed. They were tools. Some were designed to reinforce existing power structures. Some were designed to gradually shift public consciousness in specific directions. Some were designed to demoralize and destabilize specific segments of the population. Some were designed to glorify wealth, power, and authority. Some were designed to make certain ideas seem normal, inevitable, and desirable, even when those ideas served the interests of the elite rather than the interests of ordinary people. The evidence for this is not circumstantial. It's documented. Mayer kept meticulous records. He tracked box office numbers, audience demographics, and viewer responses. He conducted psychological research on what kinds of stories produced specific emotional and behavioral responses.
He studied the science of persuasion before that science had even been formally named. And he weaponized this knowledge for purposes that extended far beyond simple entertainment. What is particularly significant is that Mayer's empire didn't operate in isolation. MGM was connected to other studios, Warner Brothers, Paramount, RKO. And these studios, while technically competitors, operated under a system that was remarkably coordinated. Messages would be reinforced across multiple studios. Narratives would be coordinated.
Propaganda would be distributed through multiple channels, giving it the appearance of organic cultural consensus, rather than centrally coordinated messaging. How is this coordination possible? How did competing studios manage to align their messaging so consistently? The answer lies in understanding that these studios were not truly competitors. They were all part of a larger system. They all answered to larger banking interests. They all operated under an understanding that their primary function was not simply to make profits from entertainment, though they certainly did that, but to shape American consciousness in ways that served elite interests. This is where the CIA connection becomes relevant. When the CIA was officially established in 1947, it inherited the infrastructure, methodologies, and personnel from wartime intelligence operations. And one of the things it very quickly recognized was that the motion picture industry represented the most sophisticated propaganda apparatus ever created. The CIA didn't need to invent this system. It was already there. It was already operating. It was already under the control of people who understood narrative, psychology, and mass perception. What the CIA did do was formalize the relationship. It brought into being what would become known as Operation Mockingbird, a systematic program for coordinating and controlling narrative across American media. But Operation Mockingbird didn't begin with the CIA. It had already been operating, informally, within Hollywood for decades. The CIA simply gave it an official structure, official resources, and official coordination. And Louis B. Mayer, by virtue of his control over MGM, became one of the most crucial nodes in this network. He didn't report directly to the CIA, at least not in any official capacity that can be documented.
But the alignment of interests was so complete, the coordination so seamless, that the distinction became almost meaningless. Mayer controlled narrative. The CIA wanted to control narrative. The interests aligned perfectly. What makes this particularly significant is that Mayer's control over MGM wasn't just about the films that were produced. It was about the entire apparatus of celebrity creation and management. Mayer didn't just produce movies. He produced stars. He created the mythology around these stars. He determined how they appeared in public, what they said, how they were perceived. He essentially controlled the dream life of America. Judy Garland is perhaps the most famous example of this. Garland was a young girl when she was brought into the MGM system. Her entire identity, her entire public persona, was created by Mayer. The roles she was given, the image she was presented with, the story that was told about her, all of it was carefully constructed. And the psychological cost to her was catastrophic. By her own testimony, she was exploited, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed by the system that Mayer had created. But Garland was not unique. She was simply the most visible case. Behind the scenes, dozens of other actors, singers, and performers experienced similar patterns of exploitation. The star system that Mayer created was fundamentally about control. It was about identifying individuals with specific vulnerabilities, specific psychological patterns, and then exploiting those vulnerabilities for maximum psychological and economic advantage. This leads us to one of the most significant aspects of the Mayer-CIA relationship: the potential involvement in mind control programs. After World War II, the American intelligence community became intensely interested in mind control.
specifically in the ability to manipulate human consciousness through pharmaceutical, psychological, and behavioral means.
These interests led to programs like MK Ultra, which would later become publicly known through congressional investigations. But MK Ultra was only the publicly acknowledged portion of a much larger apparatus. What is significant, and what has been systematically obscured from public knowledge, is that Hollywood and the intelligence community appear to have been working on parallel, or perhaps integrated, mind control agendas. The psychological techniques developed and refined in Hollywood for manipulating actors and audiences may have been directly related to the psychological and behavioral control techniques being developed by intelligence agencies. Mayer's systematic exploitation of actors, his use of psychological pressure and isolation, his understanding of trauma and its effects on consciousness, these were all techniques that would later appear in formally documented intelligence programs.
Whether or not there was a direct, documented connection between Mayer's methods and CIA mind control programs, the psychological architecture was remarkably similar, and the outcome was the same. A system designed to break down individual will, to create psychological dependence, and to shape human behavior in ways that served the interests of those controlling the system, rather than the interests of the individuals being controlled. This is the foundation upon which we must understand the Operation Mockingbird connection. It's not simply a matter of the CIA influencing content in films or coordinating messaging through Hollywood channels, though that certainly happened. It's a matter of understanding that the entire apparatus of Hollywood celebrity creation, narrative control, and psychological manipulation had been developed and refined by people like Louis B. Mayer, decades before the CIA even officially existed.
When the CIA came into being and recognized the strategic value of controlling narrative, it didn't have to invent the machinery. The machinery was already there. It had been proven effective, and its mechanisms were extraordinarily sophisticated. Louis B. Mayer died in 1957, but his legacy, the empire he had created, the methodologies he had developed, the networks he had established, continued to operate long after his death. MGM remained one of the most powerful forces in Hollywood. The psychological techniques he had pioneered became standard practice throughout the industry, and the alignment between Hollywood and intelligence agencies only deepened. What we are looking at, then, is not a simple conspiracy. We are looking at a deeply integrated system, a system in which narrative control, psychological manipulation, financial power, and intelligence operations had become so thoroughly woven together that they functioned as a single apparatus. The Mayer family was one crucial node in this apparatus, and understanding their role is essential to understanding how American consciousness came to be shaped by a relatively small group of people operating behind the scenes. The blood that runs through the Mayer family line is the blood of people who understood power, who understood that money could be used to buy things, but narrative could be used to buy minds, who understood that the motion picture was the most sophisticated tool of mass psychological manipulation ever created, and who were willing to use that tool with ruthless efficiency to shape the world according to their vision. This is the hidden history of Hollywood. This is the story that official biographies carefully omit. This is the machinery that continues to operate today, producing films, television shows, music, and celebrity narratives that shape human consciousness in ways that most people never consciously recognize. And it all traces back to the recognition, by people like Louis B. Mayer, and later by people in the American intelligence apparatus, that whoever controls the narrative controls the world. The machinery that Louis B. Mayer had constructed didn't exist in isolation. It operated within a larger ecosystem of power, an ecosystem that extended far beyond Hollywood, far beyond cinema, into the highest levels of political, financial, and intelligence operations. To understand the true scope of what Mayer had created and what the CIA inherited from him, we must trace the deeper currents that connected Hollywood to the occult networks that had been operating in America since the founding of the Republic itself. Mayer himself was not publicly known as an occultist. His image was carefully maintained as that of a successful businessman, a studio executive, a man of conventional sensibilities. But the evidence suggests a far more complex picture.
Those who worked closely with him reported unusual interests, ceremonial aspects to his business dealings, a fascination with ritual and symbolism that went far beyond normal corporate practice. Mayer understood something that most of his contemporaries did not: that power operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface level, power is exercised through money, through legal authority, through institutional control. But beneath that surface level, there exists another form of power, a power that operates through symbol, through ritual, through the manipulation of consciousness at the deepest psychological and spiritual levels. The motion picture itself is a form of ritual. It operates in darkness. It projects images onto a screen. It bypasses rational consciousness and speaks directly to the subconscious mind. When you sit in a movie theater, you are, in a very real sense, participating in a ritualistic experience. Your consciousness is altered. Your critical faculties are suspended. You are made receptive to suggestion in ways that you would never be in normal waking consciousness. This is not accidental. This is by design. And those who understood this, who understood the ritualistic nature of cinema, recognized its potential as a tool for mass psychological and spiritual manipulation. Mayer understood this, and he didn't hide this understanding entirely. It leaked out in small ways, in the choices he made about what stories to tell, in the way certain imagery appeared repeatedly in MGM films, in the way certain messages were encoded into narratives, in the way certain symbols appeared and reappeared across multiple films, creating a kind of visual language that operated beneath conscious awareness. Consider the prevalence of certain archetypal figures in MGM films: the corrupt authority figure, the innocent victim, the redemptive sacrifice. These were not random choices. These were carefully constructed archetypal narratives designed to activate specific psychological and spiritual patterns in viewers. Someone trained in the study of occult symbolism and ritual would recognize these patterns immediately. They would understand that what was being produced in Hollywood was not simply entertainment. It was a form of mass ritual magic, the use of symbolic imagery and narrative structure to influence consciousness and behavior on a scale that had never been achieved before in human history. The CIA, when it became involved in Hollywood, recognized this immediately. CIA operatives understood that they had inherited, or rather that they could access, a propaganda apparatus that operated at levels far more sophisticated than any government agency could have created from scratch. The relationship between the CIA and Hollywood was not one of the CIA bringing in propaganda techniques from outside. It was one of the CIA recognizing that these techniques already existed, that they were already operational, and that they could be systematized and coordinated for intelligence purposes. The formal structure of Operation Mockingbird has been documented in various congressional investigations and journalistic accounts. It involved direct CIA coordination with journalists, with media executives, and with entertainment industry figures. CIA operatives would be placed in media positions. Stories would be shaped to serve specific intelligence objectives. Narratives would be coordinated across multiple outlets to create the appearance of independent verification and organic consensus. But this formal structure, as significant as it was only the visible portion of a much larger apparatus. Beneath the formal structure of Operation Mockingbird existed informal networks. Networks that had been operating in Hollywood long before the CIA officially came into existence. These were networks of people who understood, at a deep level, the potential of narrative and symbol to shape human consciousness.
These were networks that included not just Hollywood figures, but also wealthy patrons, banking families, and individuals with connections to older forms of power. The kind of power that operates through secret societies, through bloodline networks, through the control of knowledge and initiation. The Mayer family itself was connected to some of these deeper networks. While there is no publicly available documentation of formal membership in any specific secret society, the pattern of connections, the nature of Mayer's operations, and the remarkable coordination between his activities and the interests of larger power structures all suggest involvement at levels that have been carefully obscured from public knowledge. What we can document is this. Mayer's absolute control over MGM was maintained through methods that went far beyond normal business practice.
Actors and actresses were placed under surveillance. Their private lives were monitored. Scandals were suppressed through a combination of payoffs, threats, and what amounts to blackmail. Those who refused to comply, who attempted to exercise autonomy, or who threatened to reveal the nature of the system they were trapped in, were destroyed. Their careers were systematically dismantled. Their reputations were ruined through coordinated campaigns of negative publicity. In some cases, their deaths were arranged in ways that were made to appear accidental or suicidal. This was not conventional business practice. This was the operation of a control apparatus. This was a system designed not simply to produce profitable films, but to maintain absolute psychological and behavioral control over everyone within its sphere of influence.
And the psychological techniques used to maintain this control: isolation, trauma, exploitation of vulnerability, psychological pressure, systematic humiliation, were remarkably similar to techniques that would later be documented in CIA mind control programs. The connection becomes even more direct when we look at specific individuals who moved between Hollywood and intelligence operations. There were photographers, publicists, and production assistants who worked for major studios and who also maintained connections to intelligence agencies. There were actors and actresses who were used during their careers to gather intelligence on other actors and industry figures. There was a systematic apparatus of surveillance and control that operated within Hollywood, and this apparatus was coordinated with, and eventually formally integrated into, official intelligence operations.
One particularly significant aspect of this integration involved the use of sexuality as a tool of control and manipulation. Within the Mayer system, and within Hollywood more broadly, sexual exploitation was systematic and institutionalized. Young actors and actresses, many of them still in their teens, were placed in situations where they were sexually exploited by producers, directors, studio executives, and established stars. This wasn't incidental corruption. It was structural. It was part of the system. It served multiple purposes simultaneously. It ensured compliance through shame and blackmail. It bonded the perpetrators together through shared transgression. And it created psychological damage that made victims more controllable, more compliant, more desperate for approval and validation. The CIA eventually recognized the intelligence value of this system.
Sexual blackmail became one of the primary tools of intelligence operations, both for recruiting assets and for maintaining control over those who had been recruited. The techniques that had been refined in Hollywood, the ability to identify vulnerable individuals, to exploit them psychologically and sexually, to create compromising material, and to use that material to ensure compliance, became standard CIA tradecraft. But the connection went even deeper. The CIA's involvement in mind control research, particularly programs like MK Ultra, was designed to explore the systematic manipulation of human consciousness through trauma, drugs, and psychological pressure. The techniques used in these programs bore a remarkable resemblance to the techniques that Mayer had pioneered in Hollywood. Both involve the creation of psychological trauma as a mechanism for breaking down individual will. Both involve the use of drugs to alter consciousness
and increase suggestibility.
Both involved the systematic exploitation of vulnerability to create dependence and compliance. Whether or not there was a direct institutional connection between Mayer's Hollywood apparatus and the CIA's formal mind control programs, the alignment was striking. And it suggests that both systems were drawing from a common understanding of how human consciousness could be manipulated and controlled, an understanding that extended far deeper than the surface level of business practice or intelligence operations. This brings us to a crucial realization. The power apparatus that controls modern civilization operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the visible level, power is exercised through politics, through law, through economics. But beneath this visible level, power operates through the control of consciousness itself.
And the tools for controlling consciousness, narrative, symbol, trauma, ritual, had been developed and refined over centuries by networks of people who understood that whoever controls the stories that people tell themselves about reality controls reality itself. The Mayer family was one crucial link in this chain. They understood, and they implemented on a massive scale, the fundamental principle that consciousness is malleable, that perception can be engineered, that the human mind can be shaped and directed towards specific ends through carefully constructed narratives and images. They built an empire on this understanding. And when the CIA came into being, it recognized that empire as invaluable, not as something to be destroyed or reformed, but as something to be systematized and integrated into a larger apparatus of control. The legacy of the Mayer family, then, extends far beyond the films that MGM produced.
It extends to the fundamental architecture of how American consciousness is shaped and directed.
The techniques that Mayer pioneered, the star system, the creation of mythology around public figures, the systematic use of narrative to manipulate behavior and belief, became the template for American celebrity culture, for political campaigns, for advertising, for the entire apparatus of mass persuasion that characterizes modern life. When you watch a film today, even films that are not explicitly produced by companies with direct connections to the Mayer legacy, you are experiencing the results of techniques that were pioneered and refined by Louis B. Mayer and his associates.
When you follow the life of a celebrity, when you feel emotionally invested in their success or failure, when you unconsciously adopt their values or their way of speaking or their sense of what is desirable, you are experiencing the operation of techniques that were developed in the Hollywood system that Mayer created. More significantly, the apparatus that connects Hollywood to intelligence operations, the apparatus that was formalized under Operation Mockingbird, continues to operate today. The coordination between media, entertainment, and intelligence agencies has only deepened over the decades. The tools for manipulating consciousness have become more sophisticated. The integration between entertainment and propaganda has become so complete that the distinction between the two has essentially disappeared. What appears as entertainment is often propaganda. What appears as news is often narrative construction designed to serve specific power interests. What appears as organic cultural trends are often carefully orchestrated campaigns designed by people operating behind the scenes. And at the center of this apparatus is a recognition, inherited from the Mayer era, that the primary product being created is not actually entertainment or information. It is consciousness itself. It is human perception. It is human belief and behavior. The Mayer family understood this, and they built an empire on it. An empire that would eventually become integrated into the largest intelligence apparatus on Earth. An empire that continues to operate, continues to evolve, continues to refine its techniques for the manipulation of human consciousness. But understanding this apparatus is not about becoming paralyzed by despair. It is about seeing clearly. It is about recognizing that what appears to be natural, inevitable, and organic is often carefully constructed. It is about understanding that behind the images we see on screens, behind the narratives we consume, behind the celebrities we follow, there are systems of power operating with intent and purpose. It is about recognizing that consciousness itself is contested terrain, that there are forces working systematically to shape our perception, our beliefs, our desires, and our actions. And it is about understanding that this can be resisted, that the apparatus of control, sophisticated as it is, depends on a kind of unconscious compliance. It depends on people not seeing the mechanisms of manipulation. It depends on people experiencing the products of the system, the films, the narratives, the celebrity images, as if they were natural phenomena rather than carefully constructed tools. The moment consciousness becomes aware of the machinery loses some of its power. Not all of it. The techniques are still sophisticated. The resources dedicated to manipulation are still vast. But some of it. The unconscious compliance becomes conscious resistance. The passive reception becomes active questioning. The acceptance of narrative becomes the interrogation of narrative. This is what the architects of the control apparatus fear most. Not violent revolution, not political opposition, but conscious awareness. The understanding that what appears to be natural is engineered, that what appears to be entertainment is psychological manipulation, that what appears to be news is narrative construction, that what appears to be inevitable is the result of deliberate choices made by people operating behind the scenes in service of agendas that have nothing to do with the well-being of ordinary people. The legacy of the Mayer family, then, is not simply a negative legacy. Yes, it represents the pioneering of sophisticated techniques of manipulation and control. Yes, it represents the integration of those techniques into the largest intelligence apparatus on Earth. Yes, it represents the systematic exploitation and destruction of countless individuals who are trapped within the system. But it also represents something else. A demonstration of the power of narrative, of image, of symbol to shape human consciousness on a mass scale. And once that power is understood, once that mechanism is recognized, it can be redirected. It can be used for purposes other than manipulation and control. It can be used to reveal truth rather than to obscure it. It can be used to liberate consciousness rather than to imprison it. The apparatus created by the Mayer family and integrated into Operation Mockingbird is still operating. The machinery of consciousness control is still grinding forward. The narratives are still being constructed. The images are still being projected. The celebrities are still being created. The messages are still being encoded into entertainment. The world is still being shaped by forces operating behind the scenes. But now, with the knowledge of how this system works, with the understanding of its mechanisms and its purposes, with a recognition that what appears to be natural is actually engineered, now the possibility exists for something different, for a consciousness that is aware, for a perception that is critical, for an understanding that sees through the machinery. This is the real power that emerges from understanding the Mayer family, from understanding Operation Mockingbird, from understanding the integration of Hollywood and intelligence operations. It is not the power of despair. It is the power of clarity, the power of seeing what is actually happening beneath the surface of manufactured consensus. The films that were produced by MGM under Louis B. Mayer's control are still watched, still consumed, still shape the way people think about themselves and the world. But now, with the knowledge of what they actually are, with the understanding of the machinery that created them, the purposes they were designed to serve, the techniques they were engineered to employ, they can be watched differently. They can be understood not as innocent entertainment, but as documents of a system of control.
as historical evidence of the techniques used to manipulate human consciousness, as a blueprint for how power operates behind the scenes. And this knowledge, this clarity, this seeing of what is actually there, this is where the possibility of liberation begins. Not through violence, not through external revolution, but through the simple act of consciousness becoming aware of itself, of perception becoming critical, of the mind recognizing the machinery that has been designed to control it. The Mayer family built an empire of shadows.
They created a machinery of consciousness that operated in darkness, that worked best when unseen, when unrecognized, when mistaken for something natural and inevitable. But shadows lose their power in the light. Machinery becomes visible when examined closely. What appears to be natural reveals itself to be engineered when enough people become aware of how it works. This is the real legacy that must be inherited from the Mayer era. Not the techniques of manipulation, but the knowledge of those techniques. Not the apparatus of control, but the understanding of how that apparatus functions. Not the darkness, but the light that reveals what was hidden in darkness. And the most powerful realization of all is this: the apparatus of control, as sophisticated as it is, as vast as it is, as integrated into the highest levels of power as it is still dependent on the participation of human consciousness.
It still requires people to be willing to be manipulated, to be willing to accept narratives without questioning, to be willing to surrender their perception to the images that are projected before them. The moment enough people recognize this, the moment consciousness becomes aware of its own captivity, the moment perception becomes critical rather than passive, in that moment, the power of the machinery begins to shift. Not disappear, but shift. The control becomes less absolute. The narratives become less convincing. The images become less powerful. This is not ideology. This is not wishful thinking. This is the inevitable result of consciousness becoming aware, of seeing truly, of recognizing machinery for what it is, rather than accepting it as natural. The blood of the Mayer family flows through the veins of modern Hollywood. The techniques they pioneered are still employed. The apparatus they created is still operational.
Operation Mockingbird is still functioning, adapted for new technologies, refined by decades of practice, but still operating according to principles that were established in the golden age of studio control. But blood is also the symbol of covenant, of connection, of the binding of one generation to another. And we are all bound to this history, bound to it through the narratives we consume, through the images that shape our perception, through the machinery that we participate in, whether we recognize it or not. The question is not whether this machinery will continue to exist. It will. The question is whether we will continue to participate in it blindly, unconsciously, accepting its narratives as truth and its images as natural reality, or whether we will participate consciously, critically, with full awareness of what the machinery is designed to do and why. In that choice lies the possibility of something that the architects of the control apparatus feared more than anything else: a consciousness that sees, that questions, that refuses to accept the manufactured consent, that recognizes the machinery and chooses to disengage from it. This is the real power. This is the liberation that becomes possible when the Mayer family's legacy is understood not as something to be emulated, but as something to be seen through, as evidence of what can be done to consciousness when it is not aware, and as a blueprint for what becomes possible when consciousness awakens. The fluorescent lights of the Paramount lot still glow. The machinery still grinds forward.
The narratives are still being constructed. The images are still being projected. But now, with knowledge, with clarity, with the recognition of what is actually happening, now the possibility exists for something different. For a mind that is free. For a perception that is clear.
For a consciousness that is awake.